Bailey Bishop looked like the perfect wife in a perfect mansion until one secret name, Serafina, cracked everything open. Behind the affair was $1 billion lie, and Bailey chose justice over silence. The lesson: never mistake kindness for weakness. And never underestimate a quiet woman with the truth. Give us one like and one share for more stories. Thanks for watching.
She remained perfectly still, a marble statue amidst the opulence of the 47th floor. There was no screaming, no hysterical sobbing, and certainly no desperate pleas for reconciliation. She was simply a woman framed by the dark doorway of a sprawling Manhattan penthouse, looking down at the city lights twinkling like fallen stars far below. Her gaze shifted to her husband and the woman draped carelessly across his custom sofa. Her reaction was a masterclass in frozen composure. She turned on her heel, stepped into the private elevator, descended into the humid June night, and vanished into the city, leaving behind the entire life she no longer recognized. Yet, before she truly disappeared, she set in motion a meticulous sequence of events designed to completely dismantle his $6 billion empire brick by brick. She ensured his eventual 47-year prison sentence and quietly secured the safety of the thousands of vulnerable lives he had been ruthlessly planning to exploit for profit. She accomplished this entire clinical takedown in exactly 30 days, working from the quiet, dusty isolation of the guest cottage at the sprawling estate she was about to leave forever. Her name was Claire Whitmore, and she was done being the silent partner in his world. To understand her precise move, you must grasp who she actually was before the marriage. Long before she became just another wealthy socialite's wife, Claire had been a top-tier forensic accountant. She was among the best in the country, a professional bloodhound for corporate corruption. Her husband, despite his massive ego and his sharp, calculating intellect, had committed the most dangerous error a crooked man can make. He completely forgot who he had actually married. This is the story of how that single, arrogant oversight brought his whole world crashing down around him. Timeline 1. The house that looked like everything you ever wanted. There is a specific, quiet kind of loneliness that never announces itself with fanfare or drama. It avoids tears, screaming matches, and dramatic exits. It lacks that single, defining moment you can point to later and say, "This is exactly where everything broke." Instead, it creeps in through the slow, silent accumulation of tiny, ignored moments that you keep telling yourself don't actually mean anything at all, until the weight of them becomes impossible to carry any further. Claire Whitmore Hartwell knew that precise brand of hollow loneliness better than anyone else. But unlike others in her social circle, she possessed something far more dangerous: her deep, professional forensic training. She knew that small things always meant something. You just had to be willing to look at the patterns. She vividly remembered the exact moment, years ago, when she first decided to stop paying attention to those glowing red warning signs, choosing instead to believe a comfortable lie. It was 3 years into their marriage during a high-stakes, black-tie fundraiser dinner in the city. She was in the middle of explaining a complex foundation grant application, a project she had poured 48 hours of grueling labor into. Suddenly, she watched Daniel's eyes drift away to his phone. Not quickly, not with an apology for the interruption. It was smooth, dismissive, and entirely calculated. He looked at that device exactly like someone who had decided it was far more important than the woman sitting across from him. She fell silent, her voice trailing off into the expensive air of the banquet hall. He did not even notice the sudden lack of sound. He finished reading his message, glanced up for a split second, casually asked, "Sorry, you were saying?" Claire offered him a thin, practiced smile and replied, "It is nothing important." She tried to make it sound light and airy, but it felt hollow to her own ears. She immediately filed that hurt away in the dark, locked compartment of her mind where she stored everything she had promised herself she would never examine. That moment was only the beginning. After that night, the incidents piled up like unpaid bills. The way he introduced her at events, always "my wife Claire," with a possessive, heavy emphasis that sounded like pride but functioned like a label for a piece of furniture. The way he stopped discussing major business decisions with her entirely, as if her value had a shelf life that expired at their 10th anniversary. The crushing realization that she could not remember when he last asked for her thoughts on anything that truly mattered. None of these moments were dramatic enough to trigger a real, public confrontation. You cannot bring these tiny things up at dinner without sounding like you are cataloging petty grievances. And that was never who Claire was. So she did what so many women in her position are forced to do. She made herself useful. She became excellent at playing the part. She polished the surface of her life until it gleamed, constantly telling herself that the shine was enough to hide the rot underneath. The Hartwell estate sat at the end of Silverwood Lane in Darien, Connecticut, shielded by a tall stone wall covered in thick, tangled ivy that Claire had meticulously chosen herself 12 years prior. It was a grand Georgian house, 4 stories of pale brick and crisp white trim, surrounded by 12 acres of old-growth woodland. It was undeniably beautiful from the outside, a perfect postcard image, but inside it was suffocatingly silent, the way houses become when one massive ego fills all the available space. Before she was Claire Hartwell, she was Claire Whitmore, an elite, highly sought-after forensic accountant. Most people fail to realize the distinct difference between a standard auditor and a forensic accountant. Auditors just verify the books as they are presented. Forensic accountants conduct full-scale investigations. They are the specialists called in when a business is bleeding money and someone needs to identify exactly how, why, and by whom the theft was orchestrated. Claire had been exceptional. She thrived on catching the one lie in 1,000. She first met Daniel Hartwell at a charity auction in 2015. He was 38, dark-haired, and carried a physical intensity that forced everyone in the room to notice him. He had founded Hartwell Energy Solutions 6 years prior, turning a basement startup into a multi-billion-dollar public entity. His pride was the Aurora Core, a clean energy storage system he swore would revolutionize the world. He spoke with the terrifying, unearned conviction of someone who could no longer tell fact from fiction. Claire had found him incredibly compelling at first, but deep in the back of her mind, where her professional instincts lived, a small, stubborn warning light flickered. She noted that he was the kind of man more interested in being believed than in actually being understood. She filed that observation away, just as she did with everything else, and went on to fall in love with him anyway, convinced that her love could be the one thing that softened his jagged edges. She stepped away from her high-powered career the year they married. Daniel made it sound like a beautiful, romantic choice. He told her she should not have to deal with the soul-crushing commute and that managing the Hartwell Foundation would be far more meaningful work. She chose to believe him because it was easier than admitting to herself what she was actually sacrificing. It felt safer to accept his carefully crafted narrative than to confront the truth of her own fading professional identity. By the spring of their 10th year together, she was 41 years old. She was precise, composed, and known in their elite circles for her impeccable organizational skills and her marriage to one of the country's most admired men. What nobody dared to say, because it would have been terribly impolite, was that somewhere over the past decade, Claire Whitmore had become entirely invisible, a ghost living in the expansive, cold shadow of her husband. Being invisible, as Daniel Hartwell was about to discover the hard way, is not the same thing as being gone. Timeline 2, the gala and the name on the phone. The Future Forward Gala was the most critical event on the entire Hartwell Foundation calendar. Held every May on the south lawn of their estate under a massive, shimmering white tent, it attracted 250 of the biggest names in finance, tech, and policy. Claire spent 6 long weeks preparing for this night. The seating chart alone required 4 grueling days, because in a room filled with massive, fragile egos, where you sit is a loud statement. A mistake could cost Daniel millions in funding. That May was unseasonably warm, and the tent looked absolutely flawless. String lights twinkled through the trees like captured fireflies. Tall, expensive flower arrangements adorned every table. The band played at a volume that encouraged sophisticated conversation. Claire was in the main hall, carefully adjusting a floral arrangement, when Daniel finally tracked her down at 6:45, his presence disrupting the quiet order she had spent all day creating. He moved with the frantic, nervous pace of a man who always had somewhere more important to be. He kissed the top of her head without ever slowing his stride, his eyes glued to his phone as he continued an urgent conversation. He did not look her in the eye once during their entire exchange. She noticed it with a weary, heavy resignation, that specific, numbing way you acknowledge a pattern you have seen too many times to bother mentioning anymore. "Everything is perfect, as always," he said, his eyes still darting across his glowing screen. "Richard confirmed the Australian consortium this morning. Another 4% equity in. Tokyo is sending a pension group representative next week." He glanced up for a fleeting second, his mind clearly already elsewhere. "In 3 years, the Aurora Core will be in every major grid on the eastern seaboard. Tonight is nothing. This gala is just an appetizer. Your remarks are at 8. Claire reminded him. "Did you review my notes?" "Twice. Very thorough," he muttered, already tapping out another aggressive message. "This Valentina rollout is eating everyone's time. Her shoot got moved again, and the agency is being impossible about the location." Valentina. Claire's eyes flickered briefly to the glowing phone in his hand before returning to her flowers. Valentina Cruz was the new face of his company, a model-turned-impact entrepreneur. She had been everywhere in Daniel's life for 4 months, a constant, irritating presence. They had been introduced at the gala the previous year. Claire remembered shaking her hand and watching the way Valentina looked at Daniel. It was not just admiration. It was the focused, appraising stare of a predator who had identified a prime opportunity and was calculating the best way to capture it. Claire had recognized that predatory look, filed the file away in her mind, and had not dared to open it since that very first day, fearing what might actually be inside. Daniel walked away to take his call, leaving Claire alone in the silent hallway. She looked at the orchids in the heavy crystal vase beside her. A hairline crack ran from the rim down toward the base. She had been meaning to replace it for weeks, but she never did, standing there in the silent house, listening to the muffled, distant sounds of the catering crew. Something inside her finally shifted. A cold, absolute certainty settled in a feeling she had been ignoring for years. The gala was a masterpiece of social theater, performing exactly as Daniel intended. By the end of the evening, he had secured $23 million in pledges, and his keynote address had been nothing short of electric. Valentina Cruz was firmly in his orbit, draped in silver silk and laughing a bit too loudly at every word he uttered. Her hand lingering on his forearm with practiced familiarity, Claire moved through the crowd, her face a mask of effortless grace, wearing the same composed, empty expression she had perfected over 10 long years of high society performance. She accepted hollow compliments about the floral arrangements and the catering, her mind drifting to a hairline fracture in a vase she had noticed that morning, a tiny, jagged imperfection that seemed to mock the flawless, sterile surface of her own existence. As the final guests trickled out into the night and the staff began the mechanical work of dismantling the tent, Daniel vanished upstairs to conduct yet another of his urgent, private phone calls. Claire found herself alone, standing in the center of the vast, hollow space. The catering crew moved around her like ghosts, their actions efficient and devoid of personal connection. A dark, intrusive thought took root in her mind. What does it really mean for a woman to dedicate weeks of her life to choreographing a complex, high-stakes event for 250 of the city's elite, only to walk away feeling like an absolute void? It was as if she were a spirit haunting the life she had built, present in every minute detail of the atmosphere, yet utterly unseen by everyone within it. Her thoughts inevitably turned to the way Valentina Cruz had locked eyes with her husband, a look that burned with a predatory kind of intent. She reflected on the encrypted laptop Daniel kept locked away in his briefcase, a digital fortress of secrets she was never permitted to breach. She thought about his endless late-night calls, the sudden, suspicious rotation of his passwords, and the business trips that had grown increasingly frequent just as his capacity for her presence evaporated. She was finished with the charade. She was done with the pretense of ignoring the massive, jagged crack running right through the foundation of their life together, a fissure so wide now that it threatened to pull everything she had spent a decade building into the dark. But here is the critical pivot point, and it is a mistake most observers make when watching a life like this unravel. What Claire Whitmore Hartwell did next had almost nothing to do with the petty sting of jealousy or the ache of a wounded heart. The affair, once confirmed, was not the thing that stole her sleep or left her staring at the bedroom ceiling in the dead of night. What she discovered underneath that betrayal, buried deep within the digital shadows of her husband's work, was a catastrophe of monumental scale, something that would alter the trajectory for thousands of innocent, hard-working people who had never met her. That burden of knowledge, far more than the wreckage of her marriage, was a weight she simply could not walk away from. Timeline 3, 2 weeks in the dark. What most people misunderstand about the high-stakes world of forensic accounting is that the real skill set has almost nothing to do with the actual crunching of numbers. Figures are merely the final destination, the end point where the evidence collects after a long journey. The true dangerous skill is patience. It is the specific, sharp, and unforgiving brand of skepticism that forces you to look at a narrative everyone else has accepted as absolute truth and quietly ask yourself if it is actually legitimate. Claire had always possessed that instinct. Claire still possessed that dormant ability, though she had spent a decade being told by the world and her husband that she was not permitted to use it. She began the process with icy, methodical precision, never rushing, never letting a single flicker of emotion cross her face. By day, she remained the perfect wife to the outside world. She managed their busy household, navigated the complex foundation correspondence, and sat through every required dinner. She laughed right on cue. She asked about his trips and listened with what looked like genuine attention, keeping her mask perfectly aligned. By night, however, she began to dismantle his world. She did not attempt to brute force the encrypted laptop directly. Daniel was arrogant, but he was certainly not reckless. She drove to a nondescript electronics store in Bridgeport, a town far enough from their home to ensure total anonymity, and spent $200 in cash on a USB keylogger. It was a tiny, unassuming piece of hardware designed to sit physically between a keyboard and its port, capturing every single keystroke without leaving even the smallest digital trace on the operating system. It was the perfect, invisible tool for a woman who remembered exactly how the system worked. She planted the device in his home office docking station on a Thursday morning while he was occupied in the shower. She forced herself to exit the room at her normal, measured pace, her heart beating a steady, controlled rhythm. She did not close the heavy office door with any more force than was routine. She went downstairs, poured a glass of water, stood at the kitchen sink, looking out at the perfectly manicured garden while breathing deeply. She was finding that familiar, cold rhythm again, the same steady way she used to breathe right before a high-stakes deposition in her former professional life. She had faced far more difficult battles during her long career as an investigator, but the crucial difference was that, in those days, she had never been truly alone in the fight. 4 grueling days crawled by. On the 5th night, Daniel departed for a high-profile board dinner in the city. Claire walked to the small guest cottage at the back of the property, where a laptop she had purchased for cash weeks earlier sat waiting on the desk. Her hands were steady as she retrieved the keylogger, plugged it into the new machine, and finally opened the log file that held the keys to his world. 2 hours of useless noise scrolled past her eyes. It was a tedious stream of password attempts for news sites, banking portals, and half-typed searches that led nowhere. Then she found it, a 24-character string entered twice, with a 3-second pause between the attempts. That double entry was the telltale sign. He had simply gotten one character wrong the first time, just as anyone does with their most complex, high-security passwords, Aurora Invictus 0922. She typed it into the encrypted laptop. The drive mounted instantly. The files began to cascade across the screen. What she uncovered over the next 4 hours would shatter every remaining illusion she had been carefully maintaining about the man she had spent a decade building a life with. It was no longer just about the state of their marriage or his infidelity. It was about the fundamental nature of who he was, right down to his core. By the time the sun began to climb over the Connecticut tree line, Claire Whitmore understood something that the financial press, the investment community, and thousands of ordinary people who had put their hard-earned life savings into Daniel Hartwell's vision of the future did not yet comprehend. The Aurora core technology did not work, and Daniel had known that reality for 18 months. Timeline 4. What the numbers said. The first thing she found was the folder labeled SV. It contained photographs, hotel bookings, and messages that confirmed every suspicion she had ever harbored in agonizing detail. She sat with the evidence for a few minutes in the silence of the cottage, experiencing that cold, specific grief that arrives when you're most painful. Buried intuition is finally proven to be the absolute, undeniable truth. Then she closed the folder. The affair was not why she was there. She went deeper, digging into the digital records he believed were completely secure. Daniel had always kept her carefully separated from the company's actual operations, explaining it away as a necessary compliance measure to maintain a clean separation between the foundation and the commercial entity. She had accepted that excuse for 9 years, but she understood now that the real reason was much simpler. He had not wanted her looking at the books, because the books were a lie. She found a directory labeled Internal R&D Documentation and clicked it open. The email chain between Daniel and Dr. James Nolan, the former head of the Aurora Core Engineering Department, began 18 months earlier. The first message caught her eye immediately, with a subject line that read, "Urgent core performance data, not for distribution." She read the text once, then read it again, her eyes scanning every word for any hint of ambiguity, but there was none. The failure was absolute. Nolan's email was technical, precise, and increasingly desperate. The Aurora core was not performing anywhere near the levels projected at the Nevada test facility. The charge retention was degrading rapidly under real load conditions. The actual energy output was running at roughly 22% of what had been promised to investors. Furthermore, the containment field was showing structural stress fractures that the engineering team had not solved and, in Nolan's professional, expert assessment, could not solve without a fundamental redesign of the entire core architecture. Nolan had pleaded to halt the investor roadshow immediately, demanding they disclose the truth to the board. Daniel's reply, sent 7 hours later, was only 1 paragraph long. He told Nolan he was catastrophizing the situation, claiming the data was being managed appropriately by senior leadership. He argued that investor confidence was a critical asset that could not be jeopardized by what he termed the premature disclosure of engineering optimization challenges. Claire had to stop reading, the crushing weight of the lie pressing against her chest like a physical hand. She pushed back from the desk and stood up. The cottage was small, suffocatingly quiet, and the single lamp on the desk made the rest of the room feel like a deep, dark cavern. She walked to the window and looked out at the vast property. The main house was dark and silent, a monument to a life built on sand. The trees at the edge of the lawn stood still. In the windless night, the same lawn she had personally designed. The trees she had watched grow for 9 years. The house she had spent a decade making beautiful for a man who didn't exist. She stood there with her hand resting on the cool window frame and felt something she recognized from her old professional life. It was not anger. It was clarity, the specific, cold clarity of someone who has just confirmed exactly what they had been trying very hard not to know. Then she went back to the desk and kept reading. The chain continued for 3 weeks. Nolan grew more frantic with each message, while Daniel grew colder. harder and more detached. Then a final, damning email arrived from Richard Covey, the chief financial officer. The situation with Nolan has been fully resolved, handled with the clinical precision required for such sensitive matters. In his final communication, he confirmed that his severance package is comprehensive, complete with a non-disclosure agreement that possesses real, enforceable teeth. He has been compensated handsomely enough to ensure his silence for the next decade, and he understands precisely what happens if he chooses the alternative. Jenkins has stepped up, taking over as the lead engineer. He fully grasps that his mandate is to ensure the data aligns with our objectives, not to draft memos about theoretical concerns that do not exist. Claire sat frozen, staring at that email for an eternity, the words swimming into a blur of cold, calculated ink. It was clear now this was never a company suffering from a simple technical setback. This was a place that had fired its own chief engineer for the audacity of telling the truth, buried the proof, and installed a puppet who knew that falsifying data was now part of his daily job. She pictured James Nolan sitting at his desk, typing that first email, choosing his words with such care, trusting that the institution he dedicated his career to was honest enough to listen. She felt the weight of what that decision cost him. She finally uncovered the trail of money, buried deep beneath layers of deception. The shell company was registered in the Cayman Islands under the name VC Solutions LLC, with Valentina Cruz listed as the managing director. It took nearly the entire night to trace those convoluted flows. Hartwell Energy had awarded VC Solutions a $50 million marketing contract. On the surface, it looked defensible enough to survive an audit, but the money entering that account never stayed there. It moved through 3 layered entities into private, hidden accounts in the Channel Islands and Singapore. She knew this pattern well. Daniel was not paying Valentina for her supposed value to the company brand. He was using her business as a sophisticated vessel to drain investor capital into his own private exit fund. And Valentina Cruz, serving as the registered director of a company receiving $50 million from the man she was currently sleeping with, was certainly not a passive or naive participant in this arrangement. The transaction records were damning, clearly demonstrating that she knew exactly what was moving through her accounts. She was an active partner in this unfolding, systematic financial crime. The worst, however, was still ahead of them. Daniel was meticulously planning one final, massive round of investor funding. The meetings were already etched into his calendar. Final record-breaking raise, timed perfectly at the moment of peak stock valuation, immediately after which he and Covey would exercise their positions and sell. The company was destined to fail within mere months of the product deployment. The Aurora core would be installed. It would fundamentally fail to perform, and the stock would crater. By the time the retail investors realized the truth, Daniel would be long gone. The pension funds were bleeding out, and the university endowments were just as badly compromised. Thousands of regular people had poured their hard-earned life savings into this dream, buying into a narrative about a man who promised to save the planet. Now, Claire sat in the quiet of the guest cottage as the pre-dawn sky began to shift from a bruised, dark black to a pale clinical gray. She felt the crushing, physical weight of the files she held. This was not just evidence of fraud. It was proof of a calculated plan to steal hope from people with nothing left to lose. James Nolan had fought to stop this train wreck, doing every single thing by the book. He had reported the anomalies through proper internal channels, submitting clear data, acting with total professionalism, and putting his own reputation on the line. In return, he was paid off, replaced, and effectively silenced. Claire thought about the bitter, sharp irony of it all. The only person in this entire saga who had dared to act with integrity was the one person who had been systematically destroyed for it. It was a cold, hard lesson in how the real world actually functioned. She shut her laptop with a soft, final click and stood up. Walking back to the main house, she felt wired, her mind moving significantly faster than the chill of the morning air. She had exactly 30 days to finish what she had started. More importantly, she possessed a specific set of professional skills that Daniel Hartwell had spent 9 long years pretending did not exist, foolishly assuming she was nothing more than a trophy wife without the capacity for observation or high-level analysis. He was about to find out, in the worst possible way, exactly how wrong he was. Timeline 5, the plan finally took its true shape, creating a strategy to dismantle a billionaire's massive fraud operation from inside his own home, all while managing his public social calendar and attending his high-stakes dinners. Required a level of cold, exhausting discipline you cannot slip up, not even for a fraction of a second. You cannot let your simmering anger show at the wrong moment. You cannot let him catch you looking at him differently, because if he suspects something, he starts to wonder why, and if he wonders why, the entire operation is dead. Claire had been performing the role of the perfect, normal wife inside this house for 9 years. She was exceptionally good at it. 2. She gave herself a strict 30-day window and was methodical in a way that her old professional colleagues would have recognized immediately and respected deeply. It was time for the heavy lifting. First, she needed to secure the absolute evidence before making her next move. She had to ensure that if she went down during this process, the truth would rise to the surface in her place. No matter what happened to her, the story would come out. She made 5 complete encrypted copies of every single file on Daniel's drive, duplicating them onto 5 separate, high-capacity hard drives. One copy went into a rented safety deposit box in New Haven under an alias. Another was shipped via bonded courier to a law firm in London she had carefully researched from a secure, anonymous email account. The firm held one simple, non-negotiable instruction. If they did not receive a verification message from her by the 1st of every month, they were to deliver the package directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission without any questions. Second, the identity. She reached out to a specialist through a trusted contact from her previous life, paying entirely in cash and cryptocurrency to avoid leaving any paper trail. Within days, he provided her with a new, fully functional life as a German art historian named Sophie Brennan. The documentation was absolutely flawless, including a passport, a verified credit history, and a detailed academic background that would satisfy even the most rigorous background check if she ever needed to leave the country in a hurry to save her own life. It was enough to sail through any routine border crossing without a second look. Third, the money. She had kept her own brokerage account separate from the household finances since long before they married, a habit Daniel had never questioned, likely because he found her financial independence beneath his notice. She had also grown the household operating accounts, which she managed, into a 7-figure sum through years of smart, careful investment. She began moving these funds outward slowly, small, irregular amounts. Through 2 private holding companies she created herself. She took only what was legally hers, her premarital assets, her inheritance, and the specific amount dictated by their prenuptial agreement. She did not touch a single dollar linked to Hartwell Energy. She was not a thief. She was a witness. Now, before she walks toward the penthouse, you need to understand something about Valentina Cruz. She is not simply the other woman in this story. She is something more specific, more interesting, and significantly more culpable than the typical side character in a corporate scandal. Valentina Cruz had been raised in a small Florida town where money was always one unexpected medical bill away from total disaster. She had spent her entire 20s working with a ferocity that people who had never been that close to poverty simply cannot comprehend. She built a modeling career through sheer force of will, watching the world that people like Daniel Hartwell inhabited from the outside. She made a conscious choice that she was going to force her way inside, by any combination of strategy and opportunity. She was not stupid. In fact, she was genuinely sharp, and she understood the arrangement with Daniel with complete clinical clarity. She knew exactly what VC Solutions was designed for. She knew what the money moving through her accounts represented. She had looked at the exit plan, understood the risks, and decided that being the vehicle for someone else's massive fraud was an acceptable price for a villa in northern Italy and the financial independence she had spent her entire adult life clawing toward. She had convinced herself that she was not hurting anyone directly. She told herself the investors were just faceless institutions with enough capital to absorb losses. She believed this was just the way the world worked for those who understood the game. She was entirely wrong about all of it, and she was about to face the consequences. Timeline 6. Friday night, June 10th. 4th, the exit. Daniel had told Claire he would be in Tokyo on the 10th. His travel accounts showed no booking, but his personal calendar confirmed a dinner in Midtown. She had selected that specific night with surgical precision. She needed to be seen in that apartment. She needed Daniel to understand that she had been there and seen what she had seen. His reaction to being caught, the frantic scramble, the panic, the desperate calls to lawyers would provide the exact window she needed to finalize her escape. On the evening of June 9th, just one night before everything was scheduled to blow up, the entire plan came dangerously close to total collapse. She was in the guest cottage at 9:30, running a final, nerve-wracking check on the hard drives, when she heard the crunch of gravel on the driveway. Daniel was not supposed to be home until Friday morning. She shut the laptop, the screen going dark, and pressed herself flat against the wall beside the window. His car was sitting right there in the driveway. She stood absolutely still, barely daring to breathe, listening for the sound of his door opening and the heavy tread of his boots on the pavement. Her heart was hammering against her ribs with such violent, rhythmic force that she could practically feel the pulse thumping in her own jaw. The car sat there in the driveway, idling for 2 agonizing, drawn-out minutes that felt like hours. The headlights swept long, distorted and menacing shadows across the dark lawn. She could hear his voice, muffled and faint through the thick cottage wall. He sounded irritated and deeply distracted, talking to someone about a rescheduled meeting. Then, to her immense relief, the headlights swung around. The tires crunched on the gravel again, and he finally turned the car around and drove away into the night. She waited 5 full minutes after the fading sound of his engine before she dared to move a single muscle. She stood in the center of the cottage floor, pressing her palms flat against her trembling thighs, breathing slowly and deliberately, counting her heartbeats to steady her nerves. If he had stepped inside, if he had walked in to check the old company files she kept stashed in the cottage, if he had seen the laptop open on the table, if he had glimpsed the hard drives, the entire plan would have disintegrated in an instant. It was a terrifying, crystal-clear realization of how close she had come to losing everything. She held on to that sharp fear for exactly 30 seconds, then forced herself to set it down and breathe. He had left. The plan was still intact. She quickly packed up the cottage, walked back toward the main house, and climbed into bed. She did not sleep, but the adrenaline had faded. The next evening, she laid the sapphire dress Daniel had bought for her on the bed. She placed her wedding ring on the nightstand beside a copy of Middlemarch. She put on a plain black dress, grabbed a small purse, and walked out the door, never intending to look back at the life that had been a cage. She did not say goodbye to the house. It had never really been hers in any way that truly mattered or felt like home. She arrived at the luxury building on West 59th Street at 7:40. The elevator code was the company's founding date, because Daniel used it for everything out of pure arrogance. She had known the code for years. The way you eventually know every single one of a person's passwords when you have been watching them carefully and they stopped thinking of you as someone who actually pays attention to the details of their life. The elevator doors opened directly into the private penthouse. She had played this moment over in her mind dozens of times during the past 30 days. Surprisingly, what she felt when the doors slid open was not fear or anger, but a profound, almost eerie sense of calm. It was the same specific stillness that had always come over her when she sat down to give testimony. Everything in her life had simplified down to this single, inevitable point. Every object in the room was exactly where it was supposed to be. almost like a stage set for the final act. Floor-to-ceiling windows spanned 3 sides of the room. Manhattan spread out below them like a vast, complex circuit board glowing in the dark. A marble bar held 2 champagne flutes. Catching the light, Daniel was standing there, still in his robe, pouring a drink with his back turned to her. Valentina Cruz was sitting on the white sofa, dressed in the expensive lingerie that had been delivered to this address earlier that afternoon. They both registered her presence in the room at the exact same moment, the air suddenly freezing between them. Valentina went completely, unnaturally still, as if she had turned to stone. Daniel spun around so fast he nearly dropped his glass of expensive scotch. "Claire." He said her name like someone finally hitting the ground after a long, terrifying fall. "What are you doing here? How did you get in? This is not what it looks like." He stammered, his face pale and eyes wide with panic. "This is just a work relationship that got out of hand, and I handled it so badly. And I am so sorry you had to see this. Let me take you home, and we can talk about this properly tomorrow." He had not even finished his desperate, rehearsed sentence before she walked right past him. She crossed the room to the window and stood there, looking out at the city, 47 floors below her. The streets were moving taxis, pedestrians, and the ordinary, messy machinery of a Friday night in Manhattan, all of it brilliantly lit and completely indifferent to the disaster happening in the room behind her. "It is a beautiful view," she said, her voice steady and detached, looking down at the flickering lights of the city that had been his playground. "Claire," his voice was starting to harden now, the performance of contrition finally giving way to the cold, calculating man underneath. She turned around to face him, her expression unreadable, and she did not look at Daniel. She looked directly at Valentina. "I want to tell you something," she said, her voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion, "because I think you are intelligent enough to finally understand the truth of what you have actually signed up for in this room tonight. Think about the intricate web of VC solutions, the millions flowing through your private accounts, and those untraceable shell entities buried deep in the Channel Islands. You are well aware of this arrangement, but here is what you do not know. The Aurora Core is a complete sham. Daniel has been fully aware of that reality for 18 months. When this company inevitably collapses, and trust me, it will, you are the person listed as the registered director of the entity used to siphon investor capital into his personal exit fund. In the middle of a federal fraud investigation. That is not the position of a partner. That is the position of the person left holding the bag." The silence in that room was absolute, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone present. Valentina stood up, her movements stiff and measured. She maintained a veneer of composure, but the color had completely drained from her face, leaving her ghost white. Her eyes darted toward Daniel, carrying a question that felt like a sharp, agonizing accusation. Daniel, however, had stopped looking at Valentina entirely. His gaze was locked on Claire, and the expression shifting across his features moved through its full cycle before arriving somewhere dark, cold, and hyper-focused. She recognized it instantly. It was the specific face he wore when he was calculating exactly how to neutralize a human problem. "Whatever you think you have found," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register, "you need to think very carefully about your next move. I possess resources that you simply cannot compete with. I will dismantle your entire life. I will have you declared mentally unstable, and I will spend whatever amount of money is necessary to ensure that no one ever believes a single word you say." Claire did not blink. She reached out and picked up her purse, her composure unshaken. "You know what your real mistake was, Daniel?" she asked. She walked to the wall and pressed the elevator call button, waiting for the lift to arrive with a patient grace. "You spent 9 years actively moving me further and further from the core of your business because you thought I had stopped being useful to you. You completely forgot that I built the entire financial architecture of this company from the ground up. I designed the original administrative systems, and I never actually left them." She turned to face him one final time, looking at him the way you look at someone you have finally finished understanding. "The Aurora Core does not work. James Nolan told you that fact, and you buried him to keep the secret. The final funding round is nothing more than a calculated exit strategy, and I have everything needed to prove it. Every single email, every questionable bank transfer, every falsified engineering report meant to deceive your shareholders. All of it is in my possession, and it is ready to be handed over to the authorities, who will actually care about the truth. The game is over, Daniel, and you are the only one who does not seem to realize it. He lunged toward the elevator just as the heavy doors began to slide shut. You are nothing without me. He spat through the narrowing gap, his voice laced with pure, unadulterated desperation. The last thing she saw was his face, but it was not the face of the man who gave speeches about saving the planet. It was the face of someone beginning to grasp that the quiet, invisible woman he had dismissed for a decade had spent the last 30 days meticulously building the legal case that would end him. The doors sealed shut with a soft final click. The elevator began its smooth, silent descent down 47 floors. She walked calmly through the lobby and out into the warm June night air and did not look back. He had spent 10 years making her feel invisible. She had spent 30 days making herself completely untraceable. There is a massive difference between the two, and he was about to learn exactly what that difference was. This was the start of Timeline 7, the hours after, when the life he had carefully constructed began to crumble into dust. Daniel processed the shock at a speed that most human beings simply do not have access to. He was on his phone before Claire's car was even 4 blocks away, but he was frantically calling the wrong people, in the completely wrong order, from inside a penthouse apartment using digital systems that were almost certainly already compromised by a woman he had so badly underestimated. He drove back to his home in Darien alone at 2 in the morning, his mind racing as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The house was cold and dark, devoid of any warmth. Her clothes were still hanging in the closet, a haunting reminder of her presence. Her shoes were sitting perfectly aligned on the rack. Her wedding ring was resting on the nightstand right beside the copy of Middlemarch he had never once picked up, let alone read. He stood there for a very long time, staring at those objects, trying to process the sudden, total void she had left behind, feeling the first true cracks in his world. Then he moved to the study and tried to log into the company's main secure server. Access denied. He tried the back-end administrative portal using his secret emergency password. It loaded one single screen and then kicked him out with a message he had never seen before in his life. Session terminated by superior administrator. He tried accessing the offshore accounts next. They were all suspended, pending a full security review, leaving him with nothing but his own growing fear. He called his IT director at 3 in the morning, his voice trembling with a raw, sudden terror that seemed to vibrate through the phone line. "Find the account labeled CW. Admin," Daniel commanded, his breath hitched in his throat. "Find it and revoke it immediately," he ordered, though his authority already felt paper-thin. A long, heavy silence stretched across the line before the director spoke. "Sir, I know that account," he replied, his voice strained. "It has been dormant for 7 or 8 years. It was set up during the original system build, way back before we ever went public, long before we even had a real department." He paused again, and when he finally spoke, the shift in his tone was chilling. "It became active 6 hours ago. He said it has super administrator privileges. It is above mine. I cannot revoke it. CW admin. It stands for Claire Whitmore." The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging him back to years ago in that tiny, cramped office in Stamford. He could see it all clearly now, the days before the venture capitalists, before the magazine covers, before the hollow success. Claire had been there, sitting at a cheap folding table, methodically building the complex financial architecture of the company from scratch because he had needed her, specifically her, for exactly what she was. She was a brilliant forensic accountant who could structure the books from the ground up, navigating every single layer of the finances with a sharp, intuitive mind that he had once relied upon for his very survival. But he had simply grown past that, or so he told himself as the company ballooned. He had brought in high-priced executives like Covey and gradually pushed her out of the boardroom and into the quiet foundation of the household and the social calendar. He had stopped thinking of her as someone who understood his business, foolishly assuming her focus had shifted away from the numbers. She, however, had never stopped understanding it. He realized his mistake too late. He hired Victor Cross on the 6th day, a former federal investigator turned private practitioner. Cross was expensive, methodical, and largely unimpressed by the frantic panic of his clients. "She is your wife," Cross said, his tone flat and devoid of any sympathy. "She will surface in 2 weeks. Just wait, find her now," Daniel snapped, his hands shaking as he paced his office. For 10 long, excruciating days, Cross found absolutely nothing. No credit cards, no passport, no hotel registrations, and no car rentals had surfaced. Her cell phone was still sitting on the kitchen counter, abandoned like a useless toy. She had walked out with nothing but a small purse and then effectively ceased to exist in any database that actually mattered to the modern world. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. On the morning of the 8th day after her disappearance, Daniel stood at his bedroom window and saw 2 black SUVs churning up the long gravel driveway. He scrambled to the other window and saw, just over the tree line, the heavy, dark silhouette of a helicopter hovering in the sky. His phone rang instantly. It was Richard Covey, his voice raspy and breathless, pulling in short, shallow gasps. "They are here," he whispered. The panic evident. Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Warrants for the office and the estate simultaneously. "Daniel, they have everything. Every single scrap of paper. Every digital file. Everything is gone." The heavy coffee cup in his hand slipped and shattered against the hardwood floor, the dark liquid splashing over his shoes. Through the massive front door, which had been locked tight because she had changed all the security codes the night she left and he had not yet figured out the new ones. He could hear federal agents shouting as they identified themselves. His personal assistant was calling his phone, her voice barely coherent, cracking under the weight of the absolute disaster unfolding in the lobby below them. He stood frozen, listening to the end of his world, unable to move or even process the sheer speed of his complete and total collapse. "The letter, Mr. Hartwell. It is everywhere," she sobbed. "It is on the Journal website. It is on Bloomberg. They are reading it on every single channel." "What did you do? What did you do?" He had not known about the letter. He had not known she was writing a letter. He had not known about any of it. And that, more than anything else, was the thing he could not explain to himself as 2 federal agents walked into his study and told him to put his hands where they could see them. The confusion was blinding, a chaotic storm of realization that his wife had outmaneuvered him at every turn, hiding her brilliance in plain sight while he played the part of a master of the universe. He had looked at his wife for 9 long years and seen only the surface she allowed him to see. Tragic mistake of his own arrogance. He had never once wondered what was underneath that calm. Composed exterior, timeline 8, the letter itself, at 9 o'clock in the morning, precisely as the New York Stock Exchange opened for trading. Bonded couriers delivered identical packages to 3 addresses simultaneously. The editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, the director of enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. It was a perfectly synchronized strike. Each package contained 2 distinct, damning items, a single encrypted hard drive and a document, 14 pages long, printed on cream-colored paper in a clean, professional serif font. The title, "Read." An open statement regarding the ongoing securities fraud of Hartwell Energy Solutions Incorporated, its executive officers, and associated entities, signed at the end. Claire Whitmore Hartwell, Chartered Financial Analyst, Certified Fraud Examiner. Now here is the thing that made every editor and every prosecutor who read this letter understand immediately that they were not dealing with a scorned wife who had found some emails. The letter did not read like emotion. It read like evidence. Organized, footnoted, precise, and completely devastating. She opened with one paragraph of personal context that felt like a sharp, cold warning. She wrote, "I am 41 years old. Before I was married, I spent 7 years as a forensic accountant specializing in complex financial fraud investigation. My husband is aware of my professional background and used it in the early years of building his company. In the years since, he appears to have forgotten it. He should not have. It was a simple statement of fact. But beneath the words, there was a steel-hard resolve that left no room for doubt about her intentions or her total command of the situation she had meticulously prepared for years. And then she laid out everything with clinical precision. Section 1. The Aurora Core. Using dates, email chains, and the specific performance data from Nevada. She documented in precise technical detail the massive gap between what investors had been told and what the engineering data actually showed. She quoted the correspondence between Daniel and Dr. James Nolan directly. She named the date Nolan was fired for trying to bring the truth to light. She described exactly what happened to the person who dared to tell the truth. Every word was backed by proof that she had kept hidden, waiting for this exact moment. Section 2. The money. She traced the venture capital structures from the initial contract through the layered entities to the private accounts in the Channel Islands. She named Richard Covey as a knowing co-architect of the fraud. She named Valentina Cruz not as a personal grievance, but as a legal fact. The woman was the registered director of a shell company used to steal from investors. That was a federal crime, regardless of what else she was to him. It was not a rant about their relationship, but a cold, hard ledger of crimes that would hold up in any court in the country, destroying their defense before it even began. Section 3. The exit plan. The final funding round, the planned stock sales. The tens of thousands of ordinary people who were about to lose everything they had put into a company whose product did not work and whose leadership had known that for 18 months. And then, at the bottom of the final page, she wrote the sentence that every journalist and every prosecutor would remember for the rest of their careers. It was not a threat, but a promise of justice delivered with such quiet confidence that it resonated across the entire financial world, signaling the absolute end of the empire they had built on nothing but lies and stolen capital. She typed the message with steady fingers, knowing it was the final domino in a long, calculated plan. The drive she enclosed held every dark secret of Hartwell Energy Solutions. Was all there, laid bare. The fabricated engineering records, the deep-seated financial corruption, the private communication archives linking Hartwell and Covey in their scheme. She typed the password. James Nolan was right. And hit send by 9:23. The market panic began. Trading was halted. By noon, the stock was suspended. And by the closing bell, the company that had once seemed invincible had completely vanished from the market listing. It was gone, erased by a truth she had quietly gathered while they slept. It was $72 billion, simply wiped away in less than 8 hours. By sunset, the name Claire Whitmore Hartwell was plastered across every screen and newspaper in the nation. The media frenzy was relentless, feeding on the one detail everyone obsessed over: the mystery. How had this woman constructed the most detailed fraud case of the decade, only to vanish into thin air? No bank records, no travel documents, no digital footprint. The investigators were baffled, and the public was hooked. They eventually gave her a name that sounded like a myth. They started calling her the Ghost because she had mastered the art of total disappearance. High above the streets of Geneva, she sat in a quiet hotel room, watching her own hands tremble with an adrenaline crash. She called this phase Timeline 9, the escape reconstructed. She remembered the elevator ride, how she had deliberately pressed the P3 button instead of the lobby. The lobby was the trap, the place everyone would expect her to be, guarded by doormen and security cameras. P3 was the parking garage. She had spent 6 weeks studying the fire safety blueprints of the building, mapping every stairwell and exit, and had even conducted a dry run back in April to be certain that she would never be caught on a single camera. She emerged onto 58th Street and began walking east, moving at a perfectly normal, measured pace. It was a Friday night in Manhattan, and she was dressed in nondescript black. By blending into the crowd, she achieved a level of invisibility that felt like a superpower. It was not the kind of being overlooked that happens by accident. It was a conscious choice. She reached a 24-hour fitness center near the bus terminal, a place where she had rented a locker under an alias 3 weeks earlier. She ducked into the locker room, ready to shed her old life piece by piece, leave it behind, and step into the empty, quiet space she had earned. The expensive black dress and the designer heels went straight into a heavy, black plastic bag, which she dropped into the center's trash bin without a second glance. She pulled on the clothes she had stashed weeks ago, a pair of worn jeans, a drab gray jacket, and sensible running shoes. Then came the wig. It was shoulder-length, a mousy, nondescript brown, and it fit just a little too loosely on her head. It was the opposite of glamorous. It was completely unremarkable. It was exactly what she needed to walk through the world without a single person noticing she existed. A ghost of her former self moving through the shadows of the city she had just brought down. She knew better than to head for the obvious transit hubs. Penn Station was a trap, and JFK was an impossible dream of security checkpoints. Instead, she walked to the Port Authority bus terminal, blending in with the late-night travelers. She paid for a ticket to Montreal using crisp, untraceable cash, choosing a bus scheduled to depart at 11:15 that night. It was a mundane choice, the kind of boring, low-tech travel that kept her moving while the rest of the world looked for someone far more sophisticated than the woman in the mousy wig. She was finally free, leaving the wreckage of her marriage and the fraudulent empire behind her forever. Those 12 hours on that bus felt like a slow, agonizing crawl through a nightmare. I remember the seats being hard, cheap plastic that jabbed into my spine no matter how I tried to shift. Every time we pulled into some dimly lit service plaza in upstate New York, my heart would slam against my chest like a trapped bird. I lived in a state of electric terror, my eyes glued to the dark glass, breathing in short, rhythmic counts to stay sane. Anyone watching would have just seen a woman staring out at the rain, but inside, I was barely keeping the panic from boiling over. It was the longest, hardest part of the mission, and I knew that one wrong look or one misplaced breath could be the end of everything I had spent so long planning. Crossing into Canada at the break of dawn felt like stepping through a thin, fragile veil into a different world. My hands were freezing as I handed over the passport for a woman named Mary Ann Peters, a clean identity I had built from the ground up for this specific moment. I held my breath, waiting for the guard to say something, but he barely glanced up from his monitor and waved me through with a bored flick of his wrist. Once I reached Montreal, I withdrew 10,000 Canadian dollars from the account I had prepared and caught another bus toward Toronto. From there, I headed straight for Pearson International Airport, paying cash for my flight, carrying only a small bag with the few things I truly needed to start over. At the check-in desk, I smoothed out my face and presented my final alias. Sophie Brennan, an art historian with a valid German passport. I had a one-way ticket to Geneva tucked in my pocket. When I finally boarded the plane at 4:30, the tension was still coiled tight in my muscles like a compressed spring. As we lifted into the air and the sprawling city below faded into a gray, distant smudge, I finally closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe. It was that profound, heavy relief that only comes after carrying a crushing weight for a lifetime and finally being allowed to set it down. I was gone now. The real waiting would begin. Timeline 10, 7 days in Geneva. The hotel I chose was small, quiet, and utterly forgettable, which was exactly why I picked it. It sat in the old city, just 3 blocks from the lake. I paid for a full week in cash, walked straight to my room, and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the silence. It was a physical sensation, like stepping out of a rushing, chaotic river into perfectly still water. I had spent 30 days in a state of absolute, rigid control and constant movement, and now, having absolutely nothing to do but wait felt strangely, unsettlingly difficult for me to handle. I kept one single line of communication open, a Proton Mail account used exclusively for the London law firm. Every Monday, I sent one brief, standardized message, standing, next contact in 7 days. It was a vital safety measure. If that message failed to appear for 2 weeks in a row, the firm had strict, automatic instructions to take legal action. I sent that first check-in, feeling a strange, hollow disconnect from the world I had left behind. Then, I opened a browser to check the financial news, bracing myself for the inevitable fallout, and found that the first few days were absolute psychological torture. Hartwell Energy stock was actually climbing. Someone had leaked an analyst report that convinced investors the company was in great shape, and the devastating data I had leaked hadn't hit the public consciousness yet. By the second morning, the stock price spiked to $490 per share. Hitting a record high, I sat at the desk, staring at the number in total disbelief. After all the sacrifices I had made, after the intense, careful planning, seeing the market react this way made me feel a sudden, sharp spike of doubt. Had I truly changed anything at all? I went through the evidence again and again, obsessing over every email and financial trail I had exposed. I knew I was right. The facts were irrefutable, but sitting alone in a quiet, anonymous room in Geneva, the gap between what I knew to be true and how the world was choosing to see it felt massive. It was a lonely kind of torture, waiting for the truth to be recognized while the world continued to celebrate a lie. I was trapped in the stillness, holding the secret that would eventually burn it all down, wondering if it would actually matter in the end. I spent my mornings walking along the lake, watching the water change color before the tourists started their day. At that hour, the Alps were just dark silhouettes against a pewter sky. I found myself thinking about James Nolan, remembering the professional, precise tone of his first email. He had trusted the system to value the truth, and I knew the terrible price he had paid when that system failed him. I walked the quiet paths, my thoughts circling back to the injustice of his situation and the quiet, stubborn courage he had shown by refusing to give up his integrity. On the morning of the 8th day, the red banner flashed across my screen. Trading halted on Hartwell Energy. I dropped my fork, my heart leaping into my throat. The laptop speakers blared the anchor's frantic voice, breathless with the news of a joint FBI and SEC raid. They were hitting the headquarters. They were serving warrants. They had arrested the executive at his home in Darien. The reporter mentioned a comprehensive disclosure, a leak from the executive's own wife. I didn't need to hear the rest. I sat there, staring at my own hands, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of what I had done. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a sudden, violent release of tension I had been holding for weeks. It was a deep physical reaction, like a sneeze that comes on when you don't even realize you are sick. I had been so incredibly controlled for so long that this sudden loss of composure felt foreign to me. I let the tremors run their course, sitting on the edge of the bed and acknowledging the sheer magnitude of the moment. I had done it. I had survived the pressure. And now, the truth was finally coming out for the rest of the world. When the shaking stopped, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I stood up, splashed water on my face, deleted the Proton Mail account, and packed my small bag. It was time to go. Timeline 11. The collapse and the trial. The government moved with a speed that shocked everyone. The case was so bulletproof that the prosecution practically assembled itself, fueled by the embarrassment of federal agencies that had been outmaneuvered by one woman with a keylogger and a 30-day plan. They were not just seeking justice. They were desperate to regain their reputation after being embarrassed by my success. Richard Covey did not even try to fight. He turned on his partners within the first week. His lawyer did the math quickly, realizing that the indictment was a death sentence compared to the relative leniency of becoming a government witness. Covey's testimony was cold and calculated, the work of a man who remembered every single detail he had helped build. Valentina Cruz, meanwhile, hired a dream team of defense lawyers. They spent months painting her as a naive young woman who had been manipulated by a powerful man, a victim of Daniel S. greed who did not fully understand what was happening. That strategy worked right up until the prosecution revealed the transaction records. They had evidence of 63 separate wire transfers that Valentina had initiated herself over the course of 18 months. There were records for the Italian villa, the expensive art purchases in Paris, and a web of accounts in her mother's name scattered across 3 different countries. The narrative of the innocent victim collapsed under the weight of the paper trail. She was convicted of conspiracy and money laundering, eventually receiving a 7-year sentence that seemed small compared to the damage she had caused. Dr. James Nolan finally took the stand, looking older than his 52 years. He was quiet, and that stillness made his words even more powerful than any dramatic display could have been. He walked the court through the technical reality of the Aurora core, explaining in precise, undeniable language what the data had shown from the very start. He did not need to shout or cry. He simply laid out the truth about what happened when he had tried to do the right thing, and the facts spoke louder than any lawyer's argument ever could. He never once tried to make it about his own bitterness or pain. He answered every question with cold, clinical accuracy and then waited for the next one. The jury, and everyone watching in the courtroom, understood exactly what it had cost him to try to tell the truth the first time and how devastating it was that he had been ignored. To understand the trial, you had to be there. The media reported the verdict, but they could not capture the atmosphere of the room. It was thick with the realization of the massive failure that had allowed this to happen. The courthouse was standing room only every single day of the proceedings. People would queue up hours before the doors opened just to get a seat. The air inside the room was heavy, smelling of old, dusty wood and the restless energy of too many people crowded into a small space. Everyone knew they were witnessing something historically significant. Financial analysts who had spent years publicly praising Hartwell Energy sat in the gallery, their faces tight and careful, desperately trying to mask the fact that they had been completely, humiliatingly wrong about the entire company. There he was, Daniel Hartwell, front and center at the defense table. He wore a suit that felt just a little too expensive, a little too tailored for the gravity of his situation, testifying for 2 full days with the polished, practiced calm of a man who had built his entire career on the art of getting people to believe him. He painted a picture of himself as a brilliant visionary, a genius who had simply been betrayed by the very subordinates he had trusted to carry out his grand designs. He dropped the word visionary when describing himself no fewer than 11 times over the course of those 2 days. 11 times. The court reporter typed it out with robotic consistency, never changing expression. But in the gallery, the air shifted. You could feel it hitting the audience differently with every single repetition. That word began to lose its luster and take on a heavy, sharp irony, the kind of grating tone a phrase adopts when it has been forced into service one time too many. It was a clumsy attempt at grandiosity, a thin coat of paint on a crumbling structure. And the more he said it, the more clearly everyone could see exactly what he was trying to hide. On the second day, under the pressure of cross-examination, the prosecutor pulled up one of Daniel's own emails to Nolan, displaying it on the massive screen at the front of the room. It was the message where he had framed a dangerous, fundamental engineering failure as nothing more than an optimization challenge. She read the words slowly, letting the cold technical language hang in the air. In the silence that followed, a juror in the back row turned his gaze toward Daniel. His expression devoid of anger or contempt. It was a quieter, more final look, the look of a person who had finished their internal debate and made a permanent decision. The courtroom felt suddenly small, as if the oxygen had been drained out, leaving only the weight of undeniable, documented truth. The jury needed only 50 minutes to reach their conclusion. When the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell into such a profound, heavy silence that you could hear the steady hum of the ventilation system high in the ceiling. 41 counts, securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and money laundering, guilty on every single one. When the final count was read, there was no cheering or applause in the gallery. just the sound of 200 people exhaling in unison, a long, collective release of breath that had been held for a lifetime. For those who had been waiting for justice, this wasn't a moment for celebration. It was the simple, exhausted relief of finally being heard. 3 weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, Daniel stood up to read a prepared statement. He spoke about remorse, his good intentions, and the unfortunate ways a person can lose their way in the world. His voice cracked in all the right places, calculated to trigger sympathy. But he spoke about the thousands of people he had ruined with the detached, distant quality of someone recounting a cautionary tale about a complete stranger. It was a performance that moved absolutely no one in the room. His lawyers had coached him well, but they couldn't manufacture sincerity where there was only ego. You could see the realization slowly dawning on him that his words, once powerful enough to move markets and command rooms, had completely lost their currency. Judge Margaret Hollis sat through his entire speech, her face a mask of stone, showing no visible reaction whatsoever. When he finished, she sentenced him to 47 years in a federal prison. Before she closed the session, she uttered words that would be quoted in every major newspaper for months to come. She looked directly at him and said, "You had the attention of the entire country. You had the eyes and ears of a nation, Daniel, and you completely squandered that privilege." Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of absolute authority, cutting through the silence of the room like a blade. It was the kind of final, biting assessment that doesn't just judge an action, but dismantles the person who committed it. You held resources and a level of credibility that most people will never achieve in their entire lifetime. She continued, "You chose to use every bit of that power not to build the future you promised, but to sell a persistent, calculated lie to people who trusted you because they desperately wanted to believe the world could be fixed. You fired the only person who had the courage to tell you the truth. You corrupted your own company and destroyed your marriage. And the only honest accounting of your tenure was performed by someone you had ignored and marginalized for years." The judge leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his, making it clear that his reputation was gone and what remained was only the wreckage of his own making. The judge paused, her voice steady and cutting. "You were wrong about that." As the bailiff escorted Daniel out, the courtroom erupted in noise that lasted for a long time. Victor Cross, a private investigator paid by 3 different news organizations to track down Claire Whitmore Hartwell, had found nothing. She was a ghost. She existed in no database, no record, no paper trail after June 10th. She had dismantled a $6 billion empire and walked away before the dust even had a chance to settle. It was a masterful disappearing act, executed with the same precision she had used to dismantle his business, leaving behind only questions and a legend that would grow long after the headlines faded into history. While the world was still writing her story, Claire was in Florence, focused on her charcoal sketch. She had just received a simple notification on her phone that meant more to her than any headline ever could. It was 2 words, Timeline 12. It was the confirmation that the final phase of her work was done and that she had finally succeeded in creating the legacy she had envisioned when she first walked out of her old life. The sketch beneath her fingers was raw and unfinished, much like the new life she was carefully constructing. For the first time in nearly a decade, she felt the anchor of expectation finally lift, allowing her to just be without the constant, draining performance of being someone else's wife. 9 months later, Florence. The city smells of ancient stone, warm bread, and the metallic tang of the river, which moves slow and low between the banks during the summer heat. Claire had been living here for 8 months. She arrived by train from Zurich just 1 week after watching Daniel S. arrest on a small hotel television. She had rented a quiet apartment on a narrow street above the Arno River, where the walls are 3 feet thick and the windows look out over a courtyard filled with neighborhood cats. It was a world away from the glass-walled offices and frantic pace of her past, a place where time seemed to behave differently, moving at the speed of shadows lengthening across the terracotta roofs as the sun dipped low. The apartment was a sanctuary of books and light. There was very little furniture, just the essentials, allowing the space to feel airy and open. She had dedicated herself to learning Italian, moving past the basic phrases to understand the nuances of the language, and she found that the process of starting over was helping her rebuild a sense of self that had been lost for nearly a decade. She kept her life intentionally small, quiet, and meaningful. Every morning was a deliberate choice to be present, to drink coffee in a local shop without checking emails, and to listen to the rhythm of the city instead of the relentless, demanding noise of a corporate boardroom that had once dictated every second of her existence. She began visiting museums, not as a passing tourist, but as a student with a genuine, deep-seated interest in art. She found an unexpected passion for fresco restoration, a precise, meditative, and quiet discipline that demanded both deep scientific understanding and a remarkable tolerance for patience. It was the kind of work that required years of effort on projects that most people would walk past without a second glance. She found beauty in that invisibility. There was a profound comfort in working on something that didn't demand fame, something that existed solely for its own preservation, and she spent hours in the cool, dimly lit chambers, learning how to mend the cracks left by centuries of neglect. The director of the restoration studio near the Brancacci Chapel, a direct woman in her 60s named Giovanna, had eventually noticed her dedication. One morning, she simply handed Claire a stack of files and said, "You seem like the kind of person who knows how to look at something carefully." Claire hadn't been called that in years, and she took the compliment to heart. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since leaving the United States. Giovanna didn't care about her background, her wealth, or her past. She only cared about the work, the focus, and the steady hand. And in that small studio, Claire was finally being judged by her own merits rather than the reflected power of her husband. For 9 years, she had been Claire Hartwell, a supporting character in someone else's drama. For 9 months, she had been Sophie Brennan. Slowly, the name felt less like a costume and more like a skin. She was sitting at a small outdoor cafe with her sketchbook open when her phone buzzed, the one-burner phone she kept for a single contact. The message was from Edward Marsh, a senior partner at her London firm. It read, "Phase 2 complete." The simplicity of the notification sent a ripple through her chest, a reminder that the world she had exited was still processing the shockwaves she had carefully detonated. While she sat here, completely unseen and entirely free to begin again, she read the message while sitting in the shade of a cafe awning, watching a pigeon peck at the cobblestones near her feet. The message was short and to the point. Marsh confirmed that the victim compensation process regarding the SEC settlement had been finalized. The irrevocable directive she had filed with his firm on the very morning she fled. The United States had been fully executed, meaning the final chapter of her involvement was now officially closed and secured. She folded her hands over the table, letting the news settle. There was no victory lap, no triumphant announcement to the press, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the debt had been paid and the wreckage of her marriage had been put to a constructive, noble purpose. Her entire share of the spousal assets, approximately $86 million, after taxes, had been transferred anonymously into the endowment of the James Nolan Foundation for Scientific Integrity. As she had instructed, the foundation was now fully capitalized for the future. Its board was officially confirmed and its legal status was locked in stone. The money was finally doing exactly what she had always intended, protecting the truth rather than funding a massive, beautiful lie. It was a strange kind of justice, turning the stolen wealth of a man who had lied for profit into a shield for people who were willing to risk everything to tell the truth. She wondered briefly what he would think if he knew. Then she let it go. Marsh had attached a single news clipping to the email. It wasn't from a mainstream outlet like the Wall Street Journal, but a specialized tech publication read mostly by engineers. The article highlighted the story of Priya Sharma, a 29-year-old biomedical engineer who had been fired a year earlier for refusing to sign off on falsified clinical trial data. She had been blacklisted and pushed to the brink of ruin by her former employer. who used their massive legal team to silence her. Reading the details, Claire felt the familiar, cold ache of injustice, but this time, it was followed by a flicker of hope. The system was rigged, yes, but for once, the rigged system had been broken from the inside out. An anonymous foundation had stepped in, retaining a top-tier law firm to represent Priya. They outmaneuvered the company at every turn, forcing a full-scale federal inquiry into the falsified trial data. The result was a wrongful termination verdict and a massive settlement for Priya, giving her the financial independence to pursue her own research for years to come. She was no longer a victim. She was a pioneer, free from the corporate interference that had almost destroyed her career. Claire leaned back, watching the light hit the ancient stones of the piazza, realizing that her own sacrifice had bought this freedom. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the precedent, the idea that you couldn't always bully the truth into submission. The company was now the subject of a separate federal investigation. It was the first act of the Nolan Foundation. Claire placed the phone face down on the table and looked out at the church across the piazza. She sat with the weight of the moment for a long time. People would call this revenge. She knew. She had seen the word used in countless profiles by journalists who preferred the dramatic framing of vengeance over the more complicated, boring reality of the truth. But to her, this wasn't about hurting Daniel. It was about cleaning up the mess he had made, making sure that the resources he had squandered were used to build something that could actually stand the test of time. What Claire had actually done was something far more surgical and precise. It was an audit. She had identified a systemic misrepresentation, documented every piece of evidence, and ensured that the truth was delivered to the authorities in a way that made it impossible to bury. She had taken the money she was legally owed and redirected it toward a permanent defense fund for the next person who dared to stand up for the truth inside a powerful institution and had been punished for it. It wasn't a crime, it wasn't correction. The world might call it a scandal, but in her heart she knew it was the most honest, decent thing she had ever done. And for the first time in years, she finally felt like she could breathe. This was not revenge. This was simply the job. It was the exact same work she had been trained to do 20 years ago. And in many ways, she had never truly stopped being that person. Daniel Hartwell was not some cartoonish monster, even if the public narrative tried to make him one. She had spent a long time thinking about the complexity of his fall, trying to understand how someone so capable of building could be just as capable of total destruction. If you have ever felt trapped by a situation you could not escape, then this is the story for you. Keep watching to see how she broke free. She had thought about him many times in Geneva, on the train, and in the quiet evenings in her apartment above the Arno. Monsters are simple creatures, but Daniel never was. He was a man who wanted desperately to be a hero, and when the evidence proved he was not that person, he simply chose to believe a different story. Every terrible thing that followed was just a cascade of that one initial choice, spreading out to touch the lives of thousands of people who trusted him and his vision implicitly. She had once made her own version of that choice. For too long, she had believed what she wanted to believe about her marriage instead of looking at the mountain of evidence piling up right in front of her. She had let herself become nothing more than a piece of set dressing for his narrative. She had polished the surface of their life until it shone, and for a while she had called that enough. She swore to herself that she would never make that mistake again, and she meant it. A waiter set a fresh espresso on her table. She picked it up, her gaze never leaving her sketchbook. The loggia on the south face of the church across the piazza had been mocking her for 2 weeks. The proportions were wrong every time she tried to render them. She had been working from faulty memory instead of direct, careful observation because she had convinced herself she knew the building well enough. The drawing was honest, it kept telling her. She did not really know it at all. She focused intently, training her gaze with the precise, deliberate observation she had practiced for years. It was not about seeing what she wanted to see, but capturing the raw reality of the architecture. The proportions finally snapped into focus. An hour slipped away while the piazza buzzed with life, filled with tourists, locals, and the hum of a city waking up in the warm morning air. A young woman nearby was sketching the same facade, and they shared a quiet, knowing nod. It was that silent solidarity of two people engaged in the same creative work, where words would only be a distraction from the task at hand. At some point during the morning, without even realizing the shift had occurred, Claire felt the weight of performance lift away. She was no longer playing the role of the perfect hostess, or the composed wife, or even the mysterious figure that journalists loved to profile in their columns. She was not managing a room, a reaction, or anyone else's perception of who she should be. She was simply a woman, sitting in the sun in a city she chose for herself, doing exactly what she wanted to do, with no urgent demands pulling at her and no need to be anywhere else until she was ready. She paid her bill in cash, tucked the worn sketchbook under her arm, stood up from the cafe table. The piazza was now fully alive, with people going about their ordinary afternoons in the soft, golden light. She began walking east toward the river, moving at a slow, unhurried pace. There was no reason to rush, and the morning had been peaceful, a rare feeling she intended to savor for as long as possible. She felt at home in the rhythm of the city, letting the crowd flow around her like water as she made her way toward the scenic embankment. When she finally reached the riverbank and rested her hands on the cold stone rail above the Arno, the light hitting the water was the exact tone she had been struggling to capture in her sketch. She had been getting it slightly wrong all morning. It was not a mistake a casual observer would ever notice, but it was glaring to her. When you have spent enough time studying something with total focus, you begin to see the differences that nobody else can perceive. And it was that difference that she had finally managed to identify. She stayed at the rail for a long moment, simply looking at the water. Then she walked on. Epilogue. In the months following the trial, Claire Whitmore became something she never designed and was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable with. A symbol for women caught in difficult situations with powerful men. She became proof that the traits they were told to suppress, being too precise, too careful, or too much, were the very things that could save them. The skills she had been forced to set aside because someone wanted her smaller did not vanish. They were just waiting. For employees working inside organizations who found something rotten and were afraid to speak up, she became evidence that the truth, when properly documented and protected, can survive even the most aggressive attempts to bury it. For the regulators who had missed the fraud for years, the case became a classic study in how a compelling story can completely short-circuit the due diligence that should have exposed the crime. Daniel Hartwell was simply too good at making people want to believe him. Believing him was far easier than verifying the facts. That particular failure was not a mistake unique to those regulators. It is a deeply human tendency. After all, we want to believe the comfortable story rather than do the hard work of digging for the truth. And it is that specific human weakness that people like Claire Whitmore exist to correct. She proved that when someone cares enough to look past the narrative and into the data, the house of cards will eventually fall. No matter how carefully it was constructed or how much power stood behind it to protect the deception. For James Nolan, who retired and began teaching a graduate seminar on the ethics of technical disclosure, she was a figure he did not discuss in class or with journalists. Instead, he found himself thinking about her on his long drives home. She represented the one thing he had always hoped for but rarely saw, evidence that someone, eventually, had listened to the truth. She was a silent validation of everything he had tried to teach. A rare example of a system that finally worked because someone refused to look away. For Priya Sharma, who gave only one interview about her case, the questions were always focused on the mysterious foundation that had funded her legal defense. She answered simply, whoever they were, they understood what I was trying to do, and I think they had walked this same path themselves, at a much higher cost than I will ever fully understand. For Priya, that anonymous support was the closest thing to what had actually been intended, a lifeline that arrived when she needed it most, ensuring her survival against the odds. $86 million were directed toward protecting the next person who decides to tell the truth. In the world of accounting, there is a process called reconciliation. You take data from two separate, conflicting sources, you compare them with extreme care, and you identify every single point where they diverge. Then, you investigate those discrepancies until you can account for every penny. The work is incredibly painstaking. It is almost entirely invisible to anyone not doing it. It requires more patience than any confrontation. Claire Whitmore had spent 9 long years watching a massive discrepancy grow right in front of her. She had waited until she understood every detail completely, and then she had finally reconciled it. The books were balanced. The accounts were closed, and somewhere in Florence, in the golden light of a city that has always understood how things get broken and painstakingly restored, a woman sat at a cafe table with a sketchbook and looked at the world with the clear, patient, undeceivable eyes of someone who had finally stopped pretending not to see. If you are sitting with this story right now, thinking about a crack in a vase you have been meaning to look at, or a truth you have been avoiding in your own life, this is your reminder. Do not turn away. Look at it.